The wind whispered through the trees, rustling the dying autumn leaves as I stepped out onto the porch. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine, a stark reminder that winter was closing in. The sun had barely crested over the hills, casting long shadows across the frost-kissed grass. It was early, too early for a Saturday, but I was already awake, heart pounding with anticipation. Today was different. Josh, my best friend since childhood, had invited me on a hunting trip. It wasn't unusual for him. He grew up in a family of hunters, practically born with a rifle in his hand. But for me, this was unfamiliar territory. I'd never been the outdoorsy type. Still, when he asked, I couldn't say no. Maybe it was the way he looked at me when he asked. His hazel eyes gleaming with excitement, lips quirking into that crooked smile that always did something to my chest. Or maybe it was just the thought of spending a whole day alone with him, away from the world, away from the expectations. I grabbed my jacket from the hook by the door, slipping it over my hoodie. The cabin we were staying in was small, rustic, and belonged to his uncle, far removed from the noise of the city. Inside, Josh was already up, lacing his boots at the worn wooden table. The sleeves of his flannel were pushed up, exposing his forearms, the muscles there flexing as he pulled the laces tight. "You ready for this?" he asked, looking up at me with a smirk. I shrugged, shoving my hands into my pockets. "As ready as I'll ever be." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Man, you're gonna love it. There's nothing like being out there, just you and the woods. It's freeing." I didn't respond, just nodded. Truth was, I wasn't sure how I felt about any of this. Hunting wasn't my thing. Guns weren't my thing. But Josh? He was my thing. And maybe that was the problem. We packed up quickly. Rifles, a thermos of coffee, a couple of protein bars. The air inside the cabin was warm, but as soon as we stepped outside, the cold bit through my clothes, making me shiver. Josh, of course, was unfazed. He was used to this. As we started toward the woods, something about the quiet unsettled me. Not the usual peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that felt expectant. Like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. I told myself I was being paranoid. That this was just my nerves, the anxiety of doing something out of my comfort zone. But deep down, a small voice whispered that something about today felt different. I just didn't know why yet. We moved deeper into the forest, the crunch of frost-laced leaves beneath our boots the only sound accompanying us. Josh led the way, his rifle slung effortlessly over his shoulder, while I lagged a step behind, gripping mine awkwardly. The cold gnawed at my fingertips despite the gloves, and my breath curled in the air like wisps of smoke. Josh had always belonged in places like this. The wilderness suited him. The way he moved through the trees, silent and sure-footed, was something I'd never be able to mimic. Watching him now, the way his muscles shifted beneath his flannel, I felt something tighten in my chest. We didn't talk much at first. We just walked, the quiet stretching between us, filled only by the occasional rustle of a startled animal in the brush. Josh would glance back every so often, his lips quirking into a smirk, amused by how out of place I looked. "You doing all right back there, city boy?" he teased, his voice low but warm. I rolled my eyes. "I grew up in the same town as you, idiot." "Yeah, but I actually went outside." He laughed, shaking his head before turning forward again. I exhaled, letting my gaze drift to the trees around us, their skeletal branches clawing at the pale sky. The deeper we went, the denser the woods became, the canopy above blotting out more and more of the light. Then, suddenly Josh stopped. I nearly bumped into him. "What?" He held up a hand for silence, his body tensed. I followed his gaze and saw it, a deer, standing maybe 30 feet ahead, half hidden by the trees. My stomach clenched. Josh moved slowly, carefully unslinging his rifle and raising it to his shoulder. His expression shifted. No more teasing, no more casual smirks. Just pure focus. I should have done the same. That was the whole point of this trip, wasn't it? But as I fumbled with my own gun, my hands clumsy and uncertain, A wave of unease rolled through me. Josh exhaled, steadying his aim. The deer's ears flicked, sensing something. It turned its head toward us, its dark eyes locking onto mine. Josh's finger tightened on the trigger. I swallowed hard. Then, "Wait!" The word slipped out before I could stop it. Josh's body went rigid. Slowly, he lowered his rifle and turned to look at me, his brows drawn together in confusion. "What?" I shook my head, my heart pounding. I don't know." He studied me for a long moment, then let out a breath and ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. "Dude, you can't do that," he muttered. "You either shoot or you don't. Hesitating like that, it's dangerous." "I know," I said quickly. I don't think I can do it." Josh sighed, his jaw tightening. For a moment, I thought he was going to push me, tell me to toughen up. But instead, he just gave a small nod and slung his rifle back over his shoulder. The deer was long gone. We walked in silence after that. The deeper we ventured into the woods, the heavier the silence became. It wasn't just the usual quiet of the forest anymore, it felt different. Thicker. Unsettling. Josh must have felt it too, because at some point, he stopped and turned to me. "Something's off," he murmured. I frowned. "What do you mean?" He scanned the trees, his expression unreadable. "Just stay close." I didn't argue. Minutes passed, then an hour. We saw nothing. No deer, no birds, not even a rabbit. It was like the entire forest had emptied itself out, leaving just the two of us behind. Then, in the distance there was a sound. A branch snapping. Josh grabbed my arm, his fingers tightening. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, swallowing hard. Another snap. Closer this time. Josh moved quickly, guiding me behind a large tree. We crouched low, shoulders nearly touching. His breathing was slow, measured. Mine was anything but. "Probably just another deer," I whispered. Josh didn't look convinced. More silence. Then, the unmistakable sound of footstep. Not an animal. A person. Josh's grip on his rifle tightened. "Stay here," he whispered. Before I could protest, he moved out from behind the tree, scanning the area. I stayed where I was, my pulse hammering in my ears. A minute passed. Then another. Then, "Shit!" Josh's voice rang out, sharp and urgent. I scrambled up, heart leaping into my throat. "Josh!" No answer. I hesitated only for a second before stepping out from my hiding spot. The moment I did, something slammed into me, knocking me backward. I hit the ground hard, my breath rushing out in a painful gasp. For a split second, all I could see were flashes. Josh struggling with someone, a figure in dark clothing, the glint of something metallic, a gun. Josh cursed, shoving the stranger back. "Run!" he shouted at me. But I couldn't. My body wouldn't move. The man turned toward me, his eyes wild, and suddenly Josh was there, stepping between us. "Back the hell off," he growled. The stranger hesitated, then took a slow step back, his gaze flicking between the two of us. "Didn't think there'd be two of you," he muttered, almost to himself. Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he turned and disappeared into the trees. Josh exhaled, his whole body still tense. "You okay?" I nodded, though my hands were still shaking. "Who the hell was that?" Josh didn't answer right away. Instead, he just looked at me, his eyes darker than I'd ever seen them. "We need to get back to the cabin." He didn't have to tell me twice. The walk back to the cabin felt longer than the hike out. The silence between us was different now, no longer just the absence of words, but something heavier, something unsaid pressing down on both of us. Josh's jaw was clenched, his rifle still gripped tightly in his hands, his knuckles white. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, expecting to see that man again, lurking in the trees. But we were alone. At least, it seemed that way. The sky had darkened by the time we reached the clearing. The small wooden cabin looked almost unwelcoming now, its edges blurred by the creeping fog rolling in from the hills. Josh moved ahead of me, pushing open the door and stepping inside first. I hesitated at the threshold, suddenly unsure. Something wasn't right. "Get in," Josh muttered. I stepped inside, shutting the door behind me. The air inside was warmer, but I couldn't stop shivering. Josh locked the door, then moved to the window, peering out. His breathing was shallow, his shoulders tense. I swallowed hard. Who the hell was that guy? Josh didn't answer right away. He just let out a breath, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't know." "You don't know?" My voice was quieter than I wanted it to be, shaky. "Josh, he had a gun." "I know," he said, finally turning to face me. His eyes were dark, unreadable. For a moment neither of us spoke. Just the sound of our breathing, the faint crackle of the old cabin settling around us. Then, Josh did something that caught me completely off guard. He reached out, his fingers brushing against my wrist. Just for a second. But the touch was electric, enough to make my skin burn. I looked at him, and something passed between us. Something unspoken, something I wasn't sure either of us were ready to name. But it was there. He pulled his hand away quickly, like he hadn't meant to do it. Like he wasn't sure what had just happened either. I swallowed hard. "Josh." He took a step back, shaking his head, jaw tightening. "We don't talk about this," he muttered. "Talk about what?" My heart was hammering now. His hands curled into fists at his sides. "Nothing happened." But that was a lie. Something had happened. Something that neither of us were willing to say out loud. The air between us felt charged, like a storm about to break. My mind was racing. Was it just the adrenaline? The fear from what had just happened in the woods? Or had this feeling been there all along, buried under years of friendship, waiting for the right moment to surface? I didn't realize I had stepped closer until I saw his eyes flicker down, to my lips, then back up. The look in his eyes wasn't anger. It wasn't fear, either. It was something else entirely. And just as I was about to say something, do something, Josh turned away sharply, exhaling a shaky breath. "I'm gonna grab more firewood," he muttered, already moving toward the door. "Josh, wait." But he was gone. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving me alone in the cabin, heart racing, hands shaking, and mind reeling. I pressed my fingers to my lips, trying to steady my breath. Something had changed. And there was no going back now. I stood in the cabin, staring at the closed door, my pulse still hammering in my ears. The warmth of Josh's touch lingered on my wrist, faint but impossible to ignore. I clenched my hand into a fist, as if that could erase the way my skin had burned under his fingers. What the hell had just happened? I forced myself to breathe, rubbing a hand over my face. Maybe it was the adrenaline, the fear from earlier, the fact that we had nearly walked into something dangerous out there in the wood. Maybe it was just that, maybe. But the way Josh had looked at me, the way he had pulled away so fast, like he was afraid of something, afraid of me, that wasn't just adrenaline. I turned toward the fireplace, poking at the dimming embers with the iron rod, trying to focus on something, anything. That wasn't the way my chest felt tight and full and aching all at once. Outside, the wind had picked up, howling through the trees, rattling the window panes. He was taking too long. I pushed off the chair, pacing. He had said he was going for firewood, but it didn't take this long. Not unless he was avoiding me. And I knew that's exactly what he was doing. When the door finally creaked open, I spun around. Josh stepped inside. His arms full of logs, his movements stiff and mechanical. He didn't look at me as he kicked the door shut behind him. Didn't say a word as he set the firewood down and crouched by the fireplace, feeding new logs into the flames. The tension between us had thickened, almost unbearable now. I swallowed hard. "Josh." He didn't respond. I took a step closer. "Are we going to talk about what just happened?" "There's nothing to talk about," he said flatly, still staring at the fire. I let out a hollow laugh. "Right. Just like there was nothing to talk about earlier when we saw that guy with a gun, huh?" Josh's jaw tightened. "That's different." How? I demanded. Because I don't think it is. He finally turned to face me then, his eyes flashing. Drop it, man. No, my voice was quieter now, but it didn't waver. I saw the way you looked at me, Josh. His face paled, but his expression remained hard. You're imagining things. Am I? Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. Josh's hands curled into fists against his knees. I should have stopped, should have let it go. But something inside me, something that had been building for far too long, wouldn't let me. I took another step closer. Josh, if you don't want this, if you don't feel this, then just tell me. Say it. Right now. He didn't say anything. Didn't move. Didn't even blink. The fire crackled between us, casting flickering shadows on the walls. I could see the muscles in his neck tensing, his chest rising and falling too fast. His lips parted like he wanted to say something, needed to say something, but nothing came out. I exhaled, my throat tightening. Yeah, that's what I thought. I turned away, blinking hard, forcing down the lump in my throat. Behind me, Josh let out a sharp breath, like he was about to speak, about to stop me. But he didn't. And that silence was louder than anything he could have said. I lay in bed that night, staring at the wooden ceiling, listening to the wind claw at the cabin walls. The fire had died down, leaving only the soft crackle of embers in the darkness. But it wasn't the cold keeping me awake. It was him. Josh was in the bunk across the room, his breathing slow and steady, but I knew he wasn't asleep. I could feel it. He'd barely said another word after our argument. Just kept his distance, moving around the cabin like a ghost, his expression unreadable. And now, in the dark, with only silence between us, I could almost hear the weight of everything unspoken. I turned onto my side, staring at the back of his head. Josh. Nothing. Are you awake? A pause. Then, a quiet barely there. Yeah. I swallowed hard. Are we just gonna pretend today didn't happen? More silence. Then, his voice, softer than before, almost reluctant. I don't know. I exhaled, rubbing a hand over my face. You don't know, I repeated, my voice bitter. That's not an answer. Josh shifted, and for a moment I thought he would turn around. Face me. Say something real. But he didn't. Instead, he let out a long breath. Go to sleep. I clenched my jaw. Fine. I turned my back to him, staring at the cabin wall. But sleep wasn't coming anytime soon. And neither was the truth. Somewhere outside, a branch snapped. My eyes flew open. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it, if my brain was still stuck in the paranoia of earlier, but then I heard it again. A soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps on frozen leaves. Not an animal. I sat up slowly, my pulse hammering. Across the room, Josh shifted too. He'd heard it. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, Josh pushed back his blanket and grabbed his rifle from beside the bed. He met my gaze in the dim moonlight, his jaw tight. I nodded, slipping out of bed as quietly as I could. We moved to the window. Josh peeked out first, his body tense. I followed, my breath shallow. The trees outside swayed in the wind, but between them, a dark shape stood at the edge of the clearing. Watching. The same man from earlier. My stomach dropped. Josh cursed under his breath, his grip tightening on the rifle. Stay here. Like hell I will, I whispered back. Josh turned to me then, his expression unreadable, but beneath it I saw something else. Fear. Guilt. A decision he wasn't sure how to make. Then, without another word, he moved toward the door. I hesitated only for a second before following him. Because whatever was waiting for us out there, this time I wasn't letting him face it alone.